Hello everyone and welcome back to True Crime and Felines. My name's Brandy and every Friday we sit down and talk about a true crime case while one of or more of my 14 felines just hang out in the background and listen. So let's get started with this week's case. So this week we are going back to the early 1900s to talk about Carl Tanzler. He would end up stealing his true love from a grave and sharing a bed with the corpse for 7 years. What? Carl Tanzler was born in Germany in 1877. Even as a boy, he had a confidence about him that when he spoke, people believed what he said. He would go on later in life and over-exaggerate his experience. He would tell people he had 9 advanced degrees, but he really didn't. Now, even though Carl didn't hold those actual degrees, he did have a variety of jobs that built him experience. In Austria, he studied weather patterns, he was a boat builder, and he actually did some engineering. As a boy in Germany, he stated that he had a dream where a long dead ancestor had come to him and showed him a stunning dark-haired woman that was destined to be his true love. Now, Carl traveled around a lot. He went to various places around the world, and when he was 40 years old, he did end up getting married to Doris Schaefer, and they ended up having 2 daughters together. Now, Carl knew that Doris wasn't his real true love, and it's unsure why he got married in the first place because he would end up leaving his family and traveling to Cuba and then ending up in Florida. Now, about a year later, his family, his wife and daughters would join him in Florida. After about a year, Carl up and abandoned his family once again. He ended up moving to Key West, Florida, where he got a job in a hospital as a radiological technician. He also would change his name to Count Karl van Kassel and tell everyone he was from German royalty. It was never proved, though, that he was, and probably just another exaggeration that he liked to tell. Now, as you could probably see, Carl was a very eccentric and odd person and had some behaviors that weren't normal. But the hospital kind of put up with it because he was actually very good at his job and good people were hard to come by back then. He even ended up getting an old crashed plane and he brought it to the hospital and set it on a back lot to restore it. It wouldn't be till 1930 that Carl's whole life would change. Maria Elena Milagro de Hoyos, who went by Elena, was born in 1909 in Florida to a father who was a cigar maker and a mom who stayed at home. She was a Cuban-American woman with dark hair and stunning features. The Cuban-American culture back then was to marry early and start a family right away. So at 16, she was married off to Luis Mesa in 1926. Elena became pregnant shortly after that, but she miscarried. Due to that and other unknown circumstances, Luis ended up just leaving and abandoned her and moved to Miami, and she never heard from him again. In 1930, Elena became pretty sick, and her parents brought her to the hospital in Key West, where Carl was working. As soon as Carl laid eyes on her, he recognized her as the stunning long-haired woman that was shown to him in a dream and was going to be his true love. Unfortunately, Elena was diagnosed with tuberculosis at age 22, and back in the early 1900s, that was still fatal. Carl was on a mission to save Elena, and he took it upon himself to become her personal doctor and save her from this disease. Carl would come up with elixirs and tonics and other homemade concoctions to try and give to Elena to see if it would cure her. Without permission, he smuggled an x-ray machine and other electronic equipment out of the hospital and installed him in Elena's parents' home so he could go there every day. While he was trying to cure her during this time, he would shower her with gifts of jewelry, expensive clothing, flowers, fruits, and wine, and he would declare his love for her. It's reported that Elena did not reciprocate Carl's feelings. After all, she was only 22 and he was 53 at the time. But when you want to be saved from a fatal diagnosis, you'll probably put up with just about anything. Unfortunately, Elena died from her illness in October of 1931. Now, after Elena's death, the family was heartbroken, including Carl. He insisted on paying for all the funeral expenses and building Elena a huge mausoleum where her body could lie. The family didn't fight this much as they didn't have much money anyway. Carl would even end up renting Elena's old bedroom at her parents' house and paying the family rent. Carl pretty much became part of the family after that, even though they thought he was a little bizarre. After the mausoleum was built, Carl only made one key for it, and he kept it by his side. Carl would visit the mausoleum where Elena was laid to rest every night for 2 years. While he worked and couldn't be there during the waking hours, he had a telephone installed so he could call and talk to Elena. Now, during this time, he would claim to others that Elena talked back. Carl claimed that Elena told him that if he would take her away from this cold, dark mausoleum, that she would finally offer her hand to him for marriage and they could be together forever. Now, in 1933, 2 years after Elena had been buried, Carl stopped visiting the mausoleum cold turkey. The family thought it was a little odd, but maybe he had finally moved on. The truth of it, though, is that in the middle of the night, Carl had taken Elena's body out of the museum and, using a toy wagon, took her to the hospital. And what he did was put her in the airplane that he was restoring on the back lot of the hospital. And that would become now his laboratory. And his whole goal was to bring her back to life. Over the next couple months, Carl would try several things to try to bring Elena back. And one tactic was submerging her body in water and using electrical current to refire her heart and brain. Now, during this time, there was a new head of the hospital, and that person told Carl that he no longer wanted the plane on the hospital grounds, so he would have to remove it. Carl found a secluded area that included a shack and a small separate building, and he purchased it. He left Elena's parents' home at this time and stopped paying rent and moved to the shack. As for the restored plane, Carl convinced Elena's brother-in-law to attach it to a car and pull it to his new place of residence. Elena's brother-in-law, of course, did not know that Elena's body was inside. As you can imagine, Elena's body began decaying at a pretty quick rate. Carl would start doing some things to stop the body from decaying and keep the shape. He used hangers to stimulate her skeletal frame, and he would replace her disintegrating eyes with glass eyes. He would stuff her torso with rags to keep its shape, and he would cover her scalp using Elena's real hair, something that he got from her mother years ago after she cut Elena's hair when she was sick. He would use perfumes, flowers, disinfectants, and preserving agents to keep the stench at bay. He ended up applying mortician's wax to her face to give her a more lifelike look and preserve her beauty when she was alive. Carl ended up dressing Elena in the finest of clothes that he bought her when she was alive, and he would end up laying her in his bed where he slept next to her for the next 7 years. Now, Carl was known around town to buy these perfumes and women's clothing and gifts that he was still giving Elena. Rumors started to fly about his eccentric behavior being worse, and one local boy actually witnessed him dancing with a giant doll through his window. Elena's family began to become suspicious. Elena's sister became distressed by the rumors, and she demanded that Carl open the mausoleum so she could see her sister. At first, Carl was defiant and he refused to unlock the tomb, asking, "Why do you want to see her?" Elena's sister explained that she had become ill and she was afraid that she wouldn't live much longer, and that she wanted to see her sister in the mausoleum for one last time, and that she was still being taken care of since Carl hasn't been visiting. Something in Carl sympathized with Elena's sister, and so Carl said, "Come to my house instead." This is where he would show Elena's sister and some of her other family members what he'd actually done with Elena's body, and he was proud, saying, "Look how well she's being looked after by me." Elena's family was, of course, appalled and ended up calling the authorities. A couple days later, the police showed up at Carl's house. He did not resist and showed them Elena's body. He was then arrested for maliciously demolishing, disfiguring, and destroying a grave. While he was in jail and being interrogated, he would tell the authorities that he was doing everything he could to bring Elena back to life, and he was restoring the plane and making it into an airship. He believed if he could get Elena to the stratosphere, the radiation from outer space would penetrate her tissues and bring her back to life. Elena's corpse was seized by the authorities, and an autopsy was performed on the corpse. Amongst all the things that he did to keep her shape, they also found a paper tube between her legs in what was called a makeshift vagina. I will leave that up to your imagination what that was for. Now, Carl was never charged with necrophilia because this autopsy was done in the 1940s, which I think back then, stuff like that wasn't talked about, and it wasn't made public either. It was almost so disturbing, they just kept it under wraps. The paper tube in her body was not made public until 1972, 40 years after the initial autopsy and way after Carl had passed away. So he was never charged with necrophilia. After a couple days in jail and going back and forth with authorities, they discovered that the statute of limitations had expired for his crime of demolishing, disfiguring, and destroying a grave, so he was free to go. Now, Carl asked to have Elena's body back, which he was denied. Now, Elena's body was put on display for some reason in a church for a while, where close to 7,000 people would come see it. Some to pay their respects and others just to gawk. They then disassembled the body, or what was left of it, put it in a box, and ended up burying it in a cemetery in an unmarked grave, so Carl couldn't find it. There are only 3 people that knew where this grave was, and they never talked, so it's a mystery today where her grave is actually located. Instead of the public viewing Carl as some eccentric weirdo, he had a lot of sympathy, especially from women. They called the whole thing romantic and felt sorry for him. After Carl was released from jail, of course he was fired from his job, and so he was penniless. People would show up at his home wanting to tour where this whole weird event happened. Carl ended up taking advantage of it and would charge people, and he would give them a tour of his home, his laboratory, and the bed where Elena laid for 7 years. After a while, Carl decided he needed to be closer to his family, so he made plans to move closer to his estranged wife, but before he left, he armed himself with a timed stack of dynamite. He visited Elena's mausoleum for the last time, and then left. 24 hours after his visit, the tomb exploded. Nobody was hurt, and since the tomb exploded after Carl had already left, there was no formal investigation done. The tomb was now a pile of rubble and was never rebuilt, and the town just let nature take it back. In 1944, Carl would move close to where his estranged wife, his daughter, and his sister lived. Carl was still penniless, and his estranged wife, Doris, who they never got divorced, claimed to support him in his later life. The pair would meet weekly at a park, talk, have conversation. She would give him a few dollars for food, and they would go their separate ways until the next week. Now, the years that Carl actually had Elena's corpse, he would make a death mask of her using plaster. Carl would end up using that death mask and create a life-size doll of Elena. In 1952, at age 75, Carl passed away. Papers would say he was found on the floor in front of his Elena doll, and he was found 3 weeks after his passing. Rumors persist to this day that Carl found Elena's gravesite, dug her up, and lived out his remaining days with her. Some sources state that when he was found deceased, he wasn't on the floor, but he was in the arms of Elena's corpse or doll or whatever you want to call it. So is this a case of true love or a hopeless romantic, or is this just a creepy guy? Let me know in the comments, because I would love to know what you think. Please don't forget to subscribe, and I will be back next Friday with a whole new case. Thank you guys for stopping by. Bye.